Welcome, and thank you for joining the eCornell keynote entitled Bringing New Science to Market, Innovation, Adoption, and Health Policy Challenges. My name is Sean Nicholson. I'm a professor at Cornell University in the Department of Economics and also the School of Public Policy here at Cornell. And over the next hour, I'm going to have a conversation with two experts who are very knowledgeable about the biotech and pharmaceutical industry. And over the course of that conversation, if you have questions that you would like us to answer, please type those into the chat. Marcus will give you instructions on how to do that. So let me introduce our two panelists. First, Wyatt Gotbetter. He's the Senior Vice President and Worldwide Head of Parexel Access Consulting, and he's also an alumnus of the Sloan Program in Health Administration, which is a program that I direct here at Cornell, offers a Master of Health Administration degree. And the second member of the panel is Dr. Greg Franz, who's a medical oncologist and hematologist and practicing in Tennessee, and also is an alumnus of the Sloan Program. You can detect a common theme in our keynote today. But thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to a lively one-hour conversation with Wyatt and Greg. Let me start with a question for both of you, but I'll start with Wyatt, and it has to do with innovation. So the biotech and pharmaceutical industry is objectively the most innovative sector in the US economy. The biotech and pharmaceutical firms spend about $80 billion a year on research and development in order to try to bring new therapies to the market that can have a big effect on our health. What do you see that's of particular interest to you that's in the pipeline in some of the biotech and pharmaceutical firms that might have a big potential positive effect on the health of the population in the future?
So if we think just about the past 5 years, and of course that includes the pandemic, I think the rate of innovation and the number of launches has been remarkable, and really focusing on a few categories. Of course, we can't have this discussion without acknowledging, I think, the validation and the importance to all of us of the RNAi vaccines from BioNTech and Moderna. And Moderna, I think, on the heels of that success and being flush with sales of their COVID vaccine, is really advancing a number of therapeutic products as well as vaccines. So really advancing their RNAi technology into the therapeutic space for oncology specifically. Some things partnered with Merck, some on their own. So partnered programs perhaps being used in conjunction with immuno-oncology regimen that I'm sure Greg could speak to. But really in the same time horizon, we've seen the approval of a couple of CAR-Ts, truly advancing life-saving therapy in hematology and oncology. And I know Greg will speak to that as well. But also during this period, gene therapy, largely focused on rare disease. And there's some approvals hopefully pending with the FDA this year. But I think we'll see gene therapies becoming safer, becoming easier to manufacture, hopefully at lower cost. And there's just a pipeline of literally hundreds of programs where we'll see gene therapy go from rare disease and disease that has very high morbidity, perhaps into things that we think about as being managed, more chronically with small molecule drugs like heart failure and angina and even hypercholesterolemia. So I think just the rate of change and the validation of these technologies has advanced just so rapidly.
No, that's great. And Greg, Wyatt mentioned CAR-T therapies, and I think from prior conversations that we've had, you've had experience with your own patients with the CAR-T therapies. So do you want to talk a little bit about sort of your perspective on that therapy and maybe other similar therapies in terms of what effect they're having on patient health? And I think you've got a couple of images that you'd like to share with the audience.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me, Sean. It's good to see everybody. Let's talk about CAR-T. It's obviously a tremendous lifesaver in many hematologic cancers, lymphomas, myeloma. But as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Let's bring up some images. These are PET scan images. The first image is a patient of mine he's been my patient for several years. And for the HIPAA police, he gave full consent to have me share his clinical story here. He was a typical patient with indolent lymphoma, follicular lymphoma, a pretty nasty one that presented very advanced, got him through some rough chemotherapy, got him cytoreduced, and got him better. A lot of bad symptoms, pain, lymphadenopathy, swelling, organ dysfunction, and had a period of several years where he would respond and be off therapy for, up to 6-8 months, but would always would progress eventually, and ran through all the different lines of therapy. And it really got down to a point where he'd had about a half a dozen different lines of therapy, chemotherapy, antibodies, precision medicine, directed therapies. And it got to a point where he was not doing well and was really heading towards best supportive care, palliative care, hospice. And I'd already referred him about a year prior for CAR T. And at that time, for his specific lymphoma, the FDA approval wasn't there yet. And one of the expert physicians I work with in Nashville, I kept pinging him and I said, and I kept checking, well, the approval actually came through for his specific lymphoma in this time period. And we were all very happy. And he ended up getting this therapy, I believe, last November, December. And the second image is the after. So you can see this is what we call a complete response. And this individual is, many months out now and doing well with no evidence of disease recurrence, and his quality of life is fantastic.
No, that's amazing. And that's, we have a couple of approved CAR T therapies on the market, Food and Drug Administration approved. What about, are there similar kinds of classes of compounds that have yet to be approved that you think might potentially have sort of a similar amazing magnitude of health impact?
I'm not sure. I mean, that's a great question. Again, the theme here is, and where researchers are really, and this is an old idea that's been around a very long time, leveraging the immune system to identify and kill cancer cells, put very simply and eloquently. That's really what's going on here. This is T cells doing what T cells do against cancer cells. And I know that's a very simple explanation. It's very difficult to develop these compounds and to do this safely. But I think that's where, that's where the money is. That's where the future is. There is more things we can talk about here in a few minutes, but with something this amazing where, now you see it, now you don't, I really think we're talking about immune type therapies where the immune system does the heavy lifting if it's prompted or queued up in the right way using these incredible technologies.
Oh, great. So it takes a long time and it's very expensive for biotech and pharmaceutical firms to run the clinical trials, and even preceding that to identify compounds that are promising enough to start a clinical trial. The current estimate is it takes about $2.6 billion of investment across a portfolio of compounds in order to statistically assure a company that they're going to have one approved compound. So it's a very expensive endeavor. And so Wyatt, I know you've spent time in your professional practice looking at clinical trial design. But before we go to the clinical trial design, where do companies come up with that money? And in the sort of current climate, is it difficult for any types of companies to raise the funds that they need in order to invest in those drugs?
Sure. And first, for the audience, to put that $2.6 billion figure in perspective, so that also includes the cost of failure. And even if we think about a successful drug compound, basically, if you boil down the numbers, and there's been studies by therapeutic area and medicinal chemistry versus biologic, hundreds and hundreds of drug candidates will be considered before you start your first-in-man studies, your phase 1. And then roughly 10%, 1 in 10 of those will make it through to approval, right? So it's fraught with risk, fraught with challenge. So that $2.6 billion includes some of the cost of failure. But even if you could streamline that process, you're probably looking at hundreds of millions to $1 billion, even if you can reduce the failures. So clearly it's an expensive endeavor, and for the right therapies, obviously ones that can pay off and be profitable for the industry, and more importantly, beneficial for all of us. The amount of money that's poured into really the biotech sector over the past few years has been remarkable. And we've seen, though, a massive sea change in the past year. And the reason I focus on biotech is biotech in many ways has been the engine, the source of discovery and innovation for large pharmaceutical companies. So while you'll have Merck, Pfizer, Sanofi, GSK, and others, Takeda, the largest companies in the world that certainly have formidable R&D engines employing thousands of people, they still turn to biotech to find innovation, to find a compound that has been tested in man, that shows a proof of concept and can move forward. So VC, in the spirit of company formation and funding this innovation, has poured billions and billions of dollars into biotech. During the pandemic, with the validation again of RNAi, we saw a lot more money coming into the space. But the headwinds of the past year or two, really interest rates, and in the US more recently, some of the perceived threats of the Inflation Reduction Act, which could reduce pricing power of the industry, has really slowed down VC funding. And I think we can measure that in a few ways. One is just the overall magnitude of the dollars coming in, but also the dollars that may be coming into one particular investment. So if we were to look back 5 or 7 years for a newly formed company to receive $20 or $50 million was a big deal. All of a sudden, those commitments became 100, 200 million, because the VC funds said, okay, we can fund a company further to get through their initial clinical studies, to really demonstrate that something works, and then to create value, either through an exit, such as an IPO or a sale to big pharma, or perhaps there was enough money there for a biotech to launch the drug themselves. We've seen some of that pull back. The commitments are smaller. And I think what that means is that probably the rate of innovation will slow down a little bit, in the sense that there may be fewer programs being pursued simultaneously. So a company may really focus on the crown jewels instead of many at once. And then biotechs may again have to be more reliant on big pharma once they're in the middle of their development, to say, okay, we're going to partner with you. We're going to fund your phase 2. We're going to fund your phase 3. We're going to be your commercial partner. So maybe a little bit of going back to the past, where biotech needed big pharma more during versus a period where they probably could see funding to go all the way through.
Yeah. Very interesting. And we'll talk a little bit later in our hour about trends in some of those alliances between the smaller biotech firms and the larger pharmaceutical firms. And what Wyatt's mentioning is the pharmaceutical firms are an alternative source of funding, relative to venture capital firms, the VC firms, and that those might become increasingly important in this investment climate. Let's talk a little bit about clinical trial design. But before we talk about the design, Greg, I want to just ask you a question. The phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials that biotech and pharmaceutical firms run, they rely on principal investigators, physicians in the community to, work with them and enroll some of the patients in the clinical trial. How do you make decisions about whether or not to refer one of your patients to a clinical trial, another, a drug that hasn't been approved yet, but that's an experimental drug in testing? How does that thought process work for you?
Absolutely. So, in the medical oncology world, especially in the community like I am, and just to kind of break it down, to put it in context, about 85% of the cancer care in North America is provided in community cancer centers like the one I work at. And about 15 to 20% is provided at academic centers, major tertiary quaternary referral centers, where most of the clinical trial work is done. And how I approach it with my patients is, especially in the metastatic setting, of course, where patients are incurable, you start thinking about it the moment you see them. You have those discussions in your first meetings with them, and you establish goals of care. You establish what the expectations are, especially in the metastatic setting where their disease is not curable, and you're treating them to improve their quality of life and obviously improve their life expectancy. But you plant those seeds early, and you offer them referral to those academic centers within your region. And in my case, they're very convenient, and they can have those conversations with your partners at these institutions. So when the time comes, after they progress after the first line or the second line of therapy, they are already in that mindset, and you can leverage those, potentially life-changing therapies.
And so that, I mean, that sort of, I think, leads to the way in which the trials are being designed. And why you mentioned in your earlier comment the sort of 1 in 10 probability of a phase 1 drug actually being approved by the FDA and the length of time, and that, $1 billion, even sort of in best case scenario. Are biotech and pharmaceutical firms doing anything to try to run their trials differently? Getting the patients from people like Greg, run them differently, either to be less expensive, to be shorter, to be higher probability of approval, and if so, what are the implications of some of those changes in trial design?
Sure. So I think there's a few trends converging around this. So one is the innovation that we've spoken of, and if you were to look at the pipeline of the pharma and biotech industry, it's dominated by oncology. There's tremendous unmet need, even with the advances Greg's spoken to in CAR-T and immuno-oncology, right? There's still a great deal of mortality and of course shortened life and a lot of suffering. But it's also, I think, the attractiveness perhaps of some of the price tags in oncology. So we see pipelines skewed toward oncology, a lot of advancement in autoimmune disease, things like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, psoriasis, Crohn's disease, where there's some amazing therapies. But then also a lot of rare and orphan disease. And I think the way these trends come together, to address your question, is when we're looking at smaller populations, you're naturally looking at smaller trials. There indeed could be challenges even recruiting adequate numbers of people for a small trial, which is why you need registries. You have to work hard to find patients, look at familial histories in the case of some rare disorders. But some of these therapies also really don't lend themselves to the historic notion of a randomized control study, where one arm of the study is perhaps placebo or perhaps an approved standard of care, looking at things like statin or high blood pressure, big markets of the past that are generic today. So as a result, we have smaller studies, we have single arm studies, we have studies where ethically you really can't have a control arm, or perhaps there is no appropriate standard of care. And then the FDA itself, and there are other agencies, of course, in Europe and around the world that have done similar things. They now provide a rubric to say, for very life-threatening diseases, we will work with you. We will work with the industry sponsor to find a way to streamline the therapy. So we have names for that in the US, like breakthrough therapies, accelerated pathways, where you get more support, more guidance from the regulatory agency, but you're also partnering with them along the way to find a way to expedite the study. And one specific way in which that happens, certainly in oncology and rare disease, is the use of surrogate endpoints. And I'm not a scientist, but I think at the extreme, if we look at some things that are under review by the FDA right now, let's say in muscular dystrophy, perhaps we're not curing muscular dystrophy, or we don't have enough data from the study to show that we've really enhanced the length of life, longevity, but we know by reducing a surrogate, like a protein signal, that that's going to have a very strong correlation with the desired outcome. And in other areas, it may be reducing tumor signaling, things that are much more in Greg's domain.
Yeah, I know, and I think, when we shift to talk about adoption, Greg, if you remember, but maybe I'll try to remind you, it'd be interesting from a clinician's perspective. Well, maybe we'll just go here. We'll go a little bit out of order, but Greg, when you have drugs that have been approved using one of the intermediate markers, so maybe it's like the percent of patients whose tumor shrunk as opposed to lengthening life, does that affect? So one of these intermediate markers that allows the drug to be approved more quickly, but maybe it's not median survival, but it's something about a time to progression or response rate. Does that affect your decision-making process on whether you're going to prescribe that drug versus another drug?
That's a wonderful question. I think you're right. It's semantics to some degree, but is there clinical benefit? Does it improve symptoms? Does it improve quality of life? That'll make it easier. If there's no meaningful clinical benefit using these surrogate, endpoints, then it's hard to justify, because at the end of the day, we're human human beings taking care of other human beings. And if it improves quality of life and improves, there's clinical benefit, it's much easier to, be an adopter and, use these agents.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so you can, so it appears that there's a bit of a trade-off. I mean, on the one hand, you might get a more likelihood of getting approval using the intermediate therapy, but it then might affect the adoption. But of course, this is dynamic, right? A company that gets approval on an intermediate marker, and sometimes they're explicitly asked by the FDA to run the longer study that actually looks at the outcome that might be of greater interest to the clinician.
And indeed, over the past year, the FDA's posture has been that we're not going to give you a pass. When we ask you to run that confirmatory study, we need you to run that confirmatory study. And there's been a few, not many, drugs that have been removed from the market because perhaps they couldn't do that or they couldn't replicate the outcome. But I think we will see more confirmatory studies going on. So we don't really have conditional approvals or a drug having an investigational status, but rather a full approval, which is then also favorable for payment.
Yeah. And let me remind our audience that we strongly encourage you, if you are inspired to ask a question or make a comment, to enter it, as Marcus has given you some instructions. We do have our first one, but I'm going to take it a little bit later. But Aman Saeed, who's an MBA student interning at CVS, has a question about biologics. I'm going to try not to forget that one because we're going to talk about biosimilars, like the ones that are about to launch for Humira and that might launch for Keytruda and Opdivo. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later. So Aman, I'm going to hold your question, but I strongly encourage other people to ask questions as well. But Wyatt, let me go back to the clinical trials and talk a little bit about a push in the industry, I think, for greater diversity. Historically, a lot of the clinical trials have been dominated by white men, frankly. And so are biotech and pharmaceutical firms trying to diversify those trials, and how are they doing that? And what are the implications potentially of greater, more representative group of patients in the testing phase?
Sure, and I guess I can't sort of resist but acknowledging the irony of Greg and Sean and I perhaps lacking diversity and sort of being the historical face of many things, including clinical trial participants. There's mandates coming from the FDA and other governments, and I think very sincere efforts from the pharma industry and from clinical research organizations who enroll and operationalize the studies, such as the one I work for, to really bring diversity into studies. And, I think there's an interesting dynamic that there's an awareness in society for many, many reasons, for many historical wrongs, that we need to bring more diversity into everything we do. But it's to really ensure, as I simplify it and appreciate it, that when we study a drug, that we'll be able to show efficacy in different populations, because we're not all the same. So historically, if you were to develop a drug for people of European descent across the globe in Asian markets, they would want to know that there was a study being done in populations that the results were meaningful for them. And I think as we take that to other populations, to different age groups, different genders, it's the right thing to do. And I hopefully along the way, we're also acknowledging not just greater equity in gender and racial participation, but my company right now is working with a sponsor on a study including individuals who identify as non-binary. So I think the industry is trying to move forward in really a multitude of ways to bring the right results to studies. I also think the benefit of this is perhaps it may be more challenging for enrollment, but with this, we're seeing a lot of initiatives to bring more people and more settings into clinical trials. COVID, I think, was very much an enabler of this. In order to properly enroll the COVID vaccines from all sponsors, these were trials of tens of thousands of people, and the mandate was to make sure that they were representative of society. So with that, we saw more types of sites, more types of technologies becoming available to really connect clinical trials with clinicians and with patients. So perhaps a lesser appreciated aspect of how COVID has advanced things. But again, I think these things are coalescing.
Yeah. No, thanks. So Greg, you started talking about this, but I'm going to see if maybe you'll elaborate. So let me just kind of back up for our audience. So we talked about if you want to bring a drug to the market, you need exciting science. You need a lot of money from venture capital, from pharmaceutical firms, from your retained earnings. You need to run an efficient clinical trial. Now, once the FDA has approved a drug, can you talk a little bit about how you decide which drug you're going to use? Or in other words, like what are the factors that make a drug widely adopted and generating a lot of sales versus ones that don't end up getting used widely? How does your thought process affect that adoption decision, yours and your colleagues' thought process?
Yes, absolutely. So, in the medical oncology world, the cancer world, it's really all about two things: safety and efficacy. Is the drug difficult to give? Does the patient have a lot of adverse side effects? Is it easier to give? How do you manage those side effects? Are they easy to manage? But most importantly, you're looking at endpoints, right? And you mentioned them already: PFS, progression-free survival; OS, overall survival; duration of response, and response rate. Those are the biggies. And of course, the toxicity profile. So all those together are important. The better the PFS and OS, obviously the more successful the drug is going to be. And, the more disease types you can use it in. Let's use Keytruda, for example, right? Immune checkpoint inhibitor. And no bias here. It's just, I never thought in my lifetime as an oncologist that there would be a cancer drug that would be approved for over 30 indications and counting in cancer, which is just mind-boggling even now, even in 2023. And then we'll go to the opposite end of the spectrum, a drug called Provenge. I don't know if you remember that one, Sean, but that was a prostate cancer drug. It was, the way I like to sum it up, it was an early immunotherapy that was cumbersome, that was expensive, and really did not offer any significant clinical benefit. And you don't really hear the drug mentioned anymore. But for a few years, time goes by quickly, but the 2007, 8 to 2012, there was this big push to try to get folks with metastatic prostate cancer this drug somewhere in their treatment. And again, you don't even hear about it anymore. And for the reasons we just talked about, cumbersome, side effects, and no efficacy versus, easier to give, good toxicity profile, good efficacy. That's the opposite end, where those drugs, I believe, are obviously adopted a lot earlier and sooner. And then there you can get more into the weeds, when you get into specific tumor types, in precision medicine, in that context, and which is very important in oncology in this day and age, where you tailor treatments to the patient's specific biologic characteristics of their cancer. So, targeted agents like tyrosine kinase inhibitors in lung cancer. So a drug like osimertinib, where, there might only be 10% of your lung cancer patients that are even a candidate, but the drug, it greatly improves survival. It's very well tolerated. It's easy to give. They can take it at home. And, you were talking about diseases that, a decade plus ago or a couple decades ago were terrible, were very limited survival. Now folks are living years and they're living really well. So that's kind of a general overview of, in that context of the question you asked.
Yeah. And what about price? How, because many pharmaceuticals are expensive, how does price impact your recommendations to patients, and then also, if at all, the patient's willingness to adhere or comply with your recommendation? How does that manifest itself?
Honestly, in my 15 plus years as a medical oncologist, the only time I feel like it's been a true barrier would be in transplant, either autologous or definitely an allo, where you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, or CAR T. Obviously, in the immune checkpoint inhibitor age, the immunotherapy age, IO, it's not really been an issue. Whether the patient has insurance or isn't insured, it's really been more about are they the right candidate for the drug? Do they have the right biological characteristics, the right biomarkers, depending on how you're going to use the agent, with chemotherapy, without chemotherapy? So it's in the back of your mind, of course, and, you think about it, but, we're trained and, our hearts are to try to help the patient. So, it's there, it's in your mind, but, you try not to let it cloud, what you're trying to do, which is help, the person get better and live better.
Yeah. Now, Wyatt, cancer has, I think, some unique characteristics, not unique, but it's a life-threatening condition. And I think payers sometimes make their decisions about life-threatening conditions like cancer differently than other therapies. So maybe just broadly looking across all sorts of different therapies, it seems like some biotech and pharmaceutical firms are having trouble convincing health insurers or pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, to put their drug in a favorable position on a formulary and to pay the price. I guess, what's your perspective on that, and how are biotech and pharmaceutical firms trying to make an argument to the payer and maybe to the patient that if the price is high, it might still be a very good value?
So I think it really comes down to what Greg, and with the most respect for him as a clinician, right? Is this extending life? Is there meaningful efficacy first? And if it's maybe equivalent efficacy, are we lowering toxicity? Are we improving safety, right? How are we differentiating? And what's really emerged, as sort of the compact, the dialogue between the pharmaceutical industry and the payers, and this has been true in Europe and around the world for years, is we're not just going to support a drug because it has regulatory FDA approval, right? We need to have demonstrable value. And I know in our discussion today, we'll touch on the Inflation Reduction Act and CMS, Centers for Medicare Services, being able to negotiate price. But I think what we're seeing emerge in the US is much more focus on demonstrating and quantifying clinical value through the field of pharmacoeconomics, health economics, and so on. I think what's especially challenging, and Greg's mentioned the cost of CAR Ts, which can be $500,000, but then to date they've been hospital administered. Sometimes there are untoward events, cytokine release syndrome, that can really expand the cost of care for that patient. But then we have at really the top tier gene therapies, right? And approvals to date have been on the order of 1 to 3 million at full price in the US. And gene therapies, as we've mentioned, have really focused on rare disease. But if we take a recent approval in hemophilia, there really is value there, because a patient who's taking blood factors chronically is spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on those blood factors and still can have uncontrolled bleeds and a lot of serious health events. Well, if gene therapy can give them a durable response and reduce or eliminate the need for blood factors, then perhaps that multi-million-dollar price tag is justified, but it's justified over a long period of time. And I think that's where some of the dialogue around price and access is going, which is, as cost goes up, and you can perhaps see long-term benefit, how does one match really the timing of cost versus the timing of benefit?
Yeah, no, and of course that's an easier argument to make if a patient is staying with the same health insurer for 5 or 10 years. If enrollees, patients shift insurers, the insurer becomes a little bit less likely to embrace that sort of long horizon argument. We had a question that I said I'd come back to, and I think now's a good time to come back to, from Iman Saeed about specifically about Humira, which is the leading selling drug in the world, and I think has been for the last 10 or 15 years, or at least in the top 10 for the last since 2004. And there are about to be a number of biosimilars that are going to launch to compete with the original Humira. Biosimilars, for those of you new to the industry, are sort of like generic drugs, but for biologics, and so they're treated a little bit differently in a way that we can talk about by the FDA. But maybe I'll start with Wyatt, and then I'll talk to Greg about his experience with biosimilars. But Wyatt, thinking about Iman's question, how do the companies that are producing biosimilars, how do they make an argument to a pharmacy benefit manager to be placed on the formulary? If you know this, if you don't,
Yeah.
you can punt on it. And what is your sense for how robust the competition either is or will be between biosimilars and between the biosimilar and the original? And just as context for the audience, the U.S. is several years behind Europe in terms of embracing biosimilars, but the last couple of years has been much more approval of biosimilars. But anyway, I guess Wyatt, starting with the kind of economic argument that they make, and then Greg, I'm going to ask you your sort of decision making on whether to use the original versus a biosimilar in oncology. Yeah, go ahead, Wyatt.
Sure. So maybe for a little bit of context for the audience. So as compared to small molecule generics, which are medicinal drugs formed by chemistry, and you basically follow a cookbook and you're using the same ingredients, and excipients may vary a little bit, but you're largely showing bioequivalence in a lab setting. The regulatory guidance around biosimilars are that they're starting with biological material, a cell line, and you can't guarantee cell line A and cell line B are absolutely the same. So biosimilars have been subject to extensive clinical trials, right? A much costlier, lengthier process than what we've seen in historic generic drugs. And with that, there's some barriers to entry. And in the US, there's also been, I think, as a negotiation between the industry and government, a bit of a dance a number of years ago to say, what's the pathway by which biosimilars can come to market? So if we look at Humira, which is AbbVie's drug, Amgen was able to solicit to be the first biosimilar that came to market in January. And then there's a 6-month period, which is about to end. And then the door opens to more biosimilars coming to market. So this bears some resemblance for people who have studied this to kind of how Hatch-Waxman treated generics in the past, that you created an incentive for someone to want to be first and for others to want to race to be first, even though they may be second, third, or fourth. So there's a rigorous clinical trial process. The prize here, right, is the Humira market, which is worth many billions of dollars. And the hope is that prices fall and access improves. Now, Humira is an amazing drug. It's approved in many, many indications. And part of the clinical trial development in the US over the past few years is that maybe a dermatologist wants to know that there's data in psoriasis, and a rheumatologist wants to know that there's data in rheumatoid arthritis or ankylosing spondylitis. So folks were doing studies in multiple indications. So again, it's kind of added to the cost and development and making it harder to bring a biosimilar to market. But at the same time, production methods for biologics and the ability to outsource production has also really scaled. So those production costs should come down. And I'm not sure right now how many people or how many entities are soliciting to have a Humira biosimilar. I know for Keytruda, which is a few years out, given the size of that market, there are many companies that have expressed interest that are hopefully going to initiate studies. So the economic prize is such that many folks will enter. And if I were looking at this a number of years ago, I would have assumed there'd be fewer people entering the biosimilar space. But the nature of technology, companies in China, companies in India pursuing this, I think we are going to have more biosimilar candidates, and then presumably more of a cost reduction.
Yeah. And Greg, how do you view the biosimilars from your perspective, or you and your colleagues? So, certainly Avastin recently has a number of biosimilars. I think Epogen, Neupogen, which you probably are prescribing to strengthen the patients. Do you see them as they're usually not deemed by the FDA to be interchangeable, such that you have to separately prescribe a biosimilar, can't be something substituted by a pharmacist. But how do you and your colleagues sort of foresee or perceive whether there are differences between the biosimilar, and how does that affect your adoption decision?
Sure. I'm very passionate about them. I think they're wonderful. We use multiple biosimilars here for bevacizumab, like you mentioned, Avastin, trastuzumab, Herceptin, all the growth factors, Neulasta, and which is pegfilgrastim, filgrastim, Zargio. I just mentioned a bunch, but they're wonderful. This is something I've studied and I know a fair amount about. and the history with Europe being doing this since the early 2000s, and like you said, the U.S. is coming on late, but it is growing. But I personally have no issues whatsoever regarding safety or efficacy. Wyatt did a wonderful job, outlining and describing the rigorous process that the manufacturers have to go through, to make these biologics. And one cool thing about biologics, even for the reference drug, no two batches are ever identically the same, right? They're biologics, right? That's what's really amazing about them. There is a tolerance, right? There's a tolerance that the molecule has to be within throughout a very complex process to make these molecules, usually an antibody. But again, no two batches are ever the same, but they're close, and that's okay. It's not like a typical drug, like a chemical compound, an inorganic compound. So I am excited. I think it's wonderful, and they will lower cost over time, and patients will still get wonderful care, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I will note that we have another stakeholder in this chain, which are pharmacy benefit managers. And Sean, I heard you say that the question came from someone who's currently with CVS. So as I was reading one of my industry newsletters yesterday, there was a banner ad from CVS explaining in the most simple layman's terms what are biosimilars, clearly trying to lay out the argument for how it's good for patients, how it's going to save patients and employers and who's ever sponsoring health insurance and formularies dollars, right? So there's an education in the US that perhaps is still needed, so that the experience of clinicians like Greg gives people more comfort.
So that's actually a great segue to a question from Harry. And Harry in the audience asked a question about information and misinformation. So your description of CVS, I think, is germane. His question, and maybe I'll see whether Wyatt or Greg want to jump on this, is, we would hope, and certainly the three of us have been talking as if, consumers, decision makers are rational. You run a clinical trial, you measure intermediary markers or final markers, and then decision makers process that in a rational way. But Harry's comment is that during COVID, we saw a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And so his question is, how can we generally get a more professional, objective, unbiased, get back to a more sort of professional, unbiased approach to how we're processing information? Is there a role for the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, or other organizations? So I'll let either Wyatt or Greg jump on that one.
I can take a shot at this. It's something I think about. I'm not someone who's deeply engaged in social media, but obviously over time, and especially during the pandemic and with the polarization of politics, social media will amplify the point of view that perhaps you want to hear, right? And this, at least to me, was remarkable around vaccine hesitancy. Perhaps that's a too kind a term for it. At BIO, which is the acronym for the Biotech Industry Organization, so the trade group really for bio and pharma, they have held their annual meeting a few weeks ago, and I've been attending for years. And what I thought was incredible in the keynote from the incoming chair, the keynote from the executive director, is that their agenda for this year and beyond is to really address misinformation. That and I do agree with this sentiment. I think misinformation around the rigor of drug testing, the efficacy of drugs, is a disservice to patients. It's a disservice to the healthcare community, and then of course it has business implications. But I thought it was fascinating at BIO a few weeks ago, and I forget the exact words that they used, but basically countering dis or misinformation with proper information, and then hopefully along the way, restoring the image of the industry. Pharma and biotech, which has never been viewed the most favorably, because perhaps of allegations of profiteering, their image was improved early in the pandemic, and then it sank. And I think there's a lot of repair to be done, but the cost here is people not, or maybe not getting, or at least resisting, what's in their best interest, in my view.
Yeah, very interesting. Greg, do you want to jump on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, let me give you the clinician perspective. So, in the exam room, and there's nothing I love more than, my relationship with my patients, and that's why we do this. And I'm oftentimes the sounding board for their frustrations with the U.S. healthcare system and big insurance and big pharma, and that comes with the territory. And you need to be professional all the time, and also need to listen to their frustrations. But to repair that, you have to use a lot of finesse, a lot of respectful conversation, build trust, and gently redirect folks if they're getting a little bit too frustrated. And you kind of have to leverage your relationship and your trust with them to say, listen, you can't believe everything you hear at certain sources, and big pharma wants to improve the health of Americans. It doesn't want it to put people at undue risk and cause issues. And anytime there's a new novel therapy, especially in a situation where there was a crisis, of course, there's going to be a small percentage of individuals that will have an adverse, response or event, but typically the overwhelming majority of individuals will benefit from that, especially in the case of vaccines. And I think that you just do it one patient at a time through careful, thoughtful, kind, respectful conversation and trust.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Harry, for that thoughtful question. I'm going to turn to another question before we shift to our final theme, which is the Inflation Reduction Act and Medicare negotiating drug prices. And this is coming from Natalia. And I think I'll direct this to you, Wyatt. She's asking about what cost-saving measures pharmaceutical firms are using in their clinical trials. Now, she mentions the possibility of artificial intelligence and machine learning, which you maybe want to speak to, but maybe you also want to talk a little bit about something that's probably lower tech, but like the synthetic cohort design or the single arm trials. So I sort of let you take that one, if you will.
Sure. I mean, a bit outside my expertise, but I think where a lot of the efficiency gains will come, and let's call them what they are. Efficiency should mean that you're screening drug candidates, you're looking at biology, and you're able to bring drug candidates from a computer model to synthesizing a drug, to testing it in animals, to testing it in humans, right? To speed that process and to have more success and less failure. There's a lot of companies, and this is really outside of my expertise, that are using all sorts of AI and computational methods, synthetic biology, to make that happen. Some of these are standalone companies that are developing their own drugs. Others are partnering. Sanofi had a big announcement last week about how it's going to use these technologies to really revamp its R&D organization. Novartis had a similar announcement a year or more ago. So I think the benefit there should be speeding molecules, at least where they can have first-in-man studies. I don't know that the rubric for clinical trials, where we first test a drug in animals, and then we go on to a small number of healthy volunteers and then a small number of patients, is going to meaningfully change, because we still need that human experience, right? All the best modeling in the world, biology may dictate a different outcome, and that's why we do studies. In terms of synthetic control arms, so Sean, perhaps we should define this, and my definition may be far too simplistic. But we mentioned single arm studies before. You want to compare a patient population on study drug versus ideally a matched population to have a result. Because we have such access now to real world data, real world evidence, claims data, you can create a quote unquote synthetic control arm, a group of patients who perhaps had similar disease, similar demography, similar prior treatment, and compare the outcomes. So I think these are all ways to improve drug development, improve speed, and lower cost. I'm not aware of any one that is a panacea.
Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate that. But before we shift to the Inflation Reduction Act, let me just do a 30-second commercial. If you're enjoying what you're hearing and you want more and you want a deeper dive into these topics, consider taking the 5-week course that I'm going to be offering in August and September on Zoom, Monday, Wednesday evenings at 6 o'clock, and/or come to New York City for the symposium with 2 days of excellent speakers such as Wyatt and Greg and others. And I think you have available more information on both of those options if you'd like. Inflation Reduction Act. So this is, there were a lot of things in this 2002 law that Congress passed, but one of the most meaningful, well, certainly the most meaningful for the pharmaceutical industry and biotech industry is Congress is now requiring that Medicare negotiate directly with pharmaceutical and biotech firms. Those of you who are new to the industry, you might be like, hasn't that been happening for years and years and years? And the answer is no. When Congress created Part D, the prescription drug benefit for Medicare beneficiaries, they explicitly said that the benefit should be administered by private health insurers, United Healthcare, Humana, who would negotiate prices on behalf of Medicare beneficiaries. So Wyatt, beginning in 2026, Medicare is going to pick presumably some of the top selling drugs and will go negotiate directly. And there's lots of rules about drugs that can and can't be included in that, and how the negotiation will go. But there's no question that directionally the prices are going to go down. So as someone who observes the industry, what impact do you think this is going to have, and is it already having in the industry?
I think there's already impact, and for those who read industry news over the past week or two, big pharmaceutical companies, the trade group, have initiated lawsuits against the federal government, saying that the basis of the law is in fact not lawful, and it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But since this passed, I believe last August, so we're less than a year, there's been a lot of articles. We've been trying to study it. I was on a call with a client today trying to make sense of it. It's very threatening to the pharmaceutical industry. And then historically in the US, a pharmaceutical company, as Sean's alluding to, could set price, and with the exception of Medicaid and support for more poorer populations, and Medicaid, of course, is administered at the state level. There was pretty open pricing. So you would negotiate with CVS Caremark, you would negotiate with Express Scripts, but you didn't negotiate with the federal government. It was prohibited. How low those negotiations can go is not abundantly clear. So the pharmaceutical industry is very concerned about this, and where a good amount of the profits, the surplus, goes is into R&D. And with the US having the highest prices in the world, the argument that's been posited for years is it's really US pricing that supports a lot of the R&D efforts. And the actions that we've already seen so far in anticipation of the IRA being implemented, and portions of it were implemented this year in March, there was some modest rebating, so there are already some impacts, is that pharmaceutical companies are trimming pipelines. They're not advancing all of their drug candidates. For a drug that might have many indications, we mentioned Humira and Keytruda as historical examples, there's sort of a conundrum that if you think a drug will be so successful that it will catapult you into the top 30 or 40 drugs, which means you have, at least $1 billion in sales more, you're now subject to this negotiation. So it becomes a funny mathematical problem to say, how successful do you want to be? And many pundits are saying companies are going to continue to pursue smaller oncology indications, rare indications that will largely be outside of this negotiation. So I do think there's already impacts. We'll yet to see what will happen. But yeah, there's been some impacts on pipelines. I do think drugs that you may have advanced into many indications, you're going to be more cautious about those decisions.
And Greg, along those lines, maybe you could talk a little bit about both physicians' perceptions of lower prices and also maybe your patients' perceptions. So, what Wyatt described is also what economists like me think, which is the high prices are creating profits, but they're also creating the willingness of biotech and pharmaceutical firms to invest a lot in R&D. If prices come down, there might be a trade-off. There might be less innovation. I guess, does that argument resonate with physicians and patients? So what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it does. And one thing to remember, and specifically with oncology, 70 cents, at least 70 cents of every dollar spent in oncology goes towards the drug. So that means the other 30 cents pays for the imaging, for the surgery, for the radiation, for the physicians, the testing, the expense, so right off the top, that's a big, and it's been that way and it may be more, it's minimum 70. So it's been that way for a very long time. So, and honestly, most folks who are on cancer therapy, they're agnostic to it because again, most of them don't really, end up footing the bill out of their pocket. It's only my benign heme patients that have to pay for their novel oral anticoagulant like Xarelto or Eliquis that complain to me about what their out of pocket is, because honestly, a lot of times for expensive small molecules, tyrosine kinase inhibitors, there's plenty of programs where patients get the medication for next to nothing. I almost always, especially with the oral anti-cancer therapies. So it's a complex answer.
Yeah.
And I feel not to be apologetic for the industry, but I do feel I think the advancements in oncology are remarkable, and so are the costs, as Greg said. Pharmaceuticals taken as a whole are 10% or less of the total U.S. healthcare spend. So it is, as we know, so incredibly complex.
Yeah. So we're just about out of time, but I think we have enough time, and we didn't rehearse this. So Wyatt and Greg, maybe you don't have anything prepared, but I think you'll be able to think on your feet. Maybe, Wyatt and then Greg, take a minute or a minute and a half, and, anything that we haven't talked about today that you just want to sort of plant a seed in the minds of the audience about sort of key issues, exciting things, concerns in the industry, something that you think is important that we just didn't have time to cover, if you want to just kind of put a bookmark for people to think about.
Personally, not being a scientist, not being a STEM person, but spending my career in this field, I am in awe and have so much respect for the work of academia, which feeds the work of biotech, which, as we discussed, then fuels pharma and creates all of this great innovation that clinicians like Greg can deliver to patients. And I really do think over the past few years, there's been a pivot from managing disease symptoms to really working toward curative disease, the holy grail, curing disease, the holy grail of drugs that are disease modifying, of drugs that can be curative, and perhaps with gene therapy and gene editing, which we haven't really touched on, the ability to actually have one-time administration with long-term results. The politicization and costs are incredibly meaningful, but I think the science is incredible.
Thanks. Greg?
I'm right there with you, Wyatt. There's never been a better time, despite all of the financial toxicity, as we like to say, and all the cost challenges. There's never been a better time to be a clinician in the cancer, world, cancer sphere. The innovations that I've seen in my short 20 years, from residency till now, are nothing short of amazing, with personalized medicine, personalized cancer care, where we do tumor profiling, looking at broad panel NGS to identify specific biologic targets and driver mutations, along with immunotherapy and CAR T. It is just truly amazing, and we're so fortunate. And I as well greatly respect and enjoy my relationships with my colleagues in academia that I work with and refer a lot of patients for trials.
Well, it's heartening to end on a very positive note. So thank you both for doing that. Let me thank Wyatt and Greg. Give you all virtual applause. Thank you for taking an hour out of your time for sharing your insights with us. Thank you, audience, for joining us for an hour. if you're interested in learning more about the course, more about the symposium, reach out to eCornell. They can, I'm sure, provide you with more information. And best of luck to everyone in their ventures. But thank you very much, Wyatt and Greg.
Thank you.